OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called The Trace of Believability, which is a phrase that describes how James Wood felt about hysterical realism, and James Wood is a very good literary critic, where basically, in historical realism, the rapid accretion of interesting detail breaks the trance of believability. And there's an essay that goes into detail on this by Lee Konstantinou, saying his name incorrectly, and it's a collection on David Foster Wallace, and it's very good. And I really like this phrase, the trance of believability, that I think is helpful for understanding a lot of issues in society today. You know, it actually gets tied up with the Habermas legitimation crisis, because if we don't believe, say, that the law is just, if we don't believe that the government is competent, if we don't believe our boss is competent, if we don't believe that God exists, or that our wife loves us, then the trance of believability snaps, it breaks. And this is, of course, tied to Givens, which is discussed throughout Belonging Again. And ultimately, the idea is that society works when we're in a kind of trance of believability, when we're thoughtless about it, when we're not always wondering if we can trust society. There's another paper called On Trust that basically is going to say that trust is something we either give or don't give, but it can't be something earned because it is the very ground on which phenomenon occur. And so if you don't grant that ground to phenomenon and wait until they earn it, well, they never can. And that's a little hysteric, but it's expanded on on the paper On Trust. So society operates when we're caught in a trance of believability about it. But of course, the problem here is where there is thoughtlessness, although that reduces existential anxiety, it also risks the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about, because then because true evil has to be something, is often in history, something that has to become everyday, something that's banal every day in order for the mass of people to commit it and to do it without thought. If people in mass were doing something that they thought might be evil, then that phenomenon Hannah describes probably would not occur. So thoughtlessness and the banality of evil go together. But at the same time, where the trance of believability is broken, there can be more existential anxiety because we're more free and we have to think all the time. And then just to return to a state of existential stability, totalitarianism can become appealing. But this is taken up quite extensively in Belonging Again. The other issue that happens is when the trance of believability breaks, Givens and all that. We have nothing to defend ourselves from what Kierkegaard called the infinite absolute negativity, which a simple way to put this is, and he borrows that from Hegel, interesting, even though Kierkegaard does not like Hegel, I would associate the infinite absolute negativity with eternal regression. And this is basically the idea that irony can always ironize irony, cynicism can always be cynical about cynicism, anti-politicians can be anti-politicians against anti-politicians who are against anti-politicians, and it goes on and on and on and on. This sort of infinite collapsing, meta-irony, I guess all those different things, where it just never stops. And it can eternally regress. And I also associate this with Nietzsche's concern, where he talks about after the death of God, that the earth is unchained from its sun and how it can just kind of fly off. So today, where the trance of believability is broken, irony is sort of unchained from constructive criticism and easily becomes nihilistic, and there's no stopping it. It just goes on forever. This can even get into, I guess, Quentin, the French philosopher, on how Kant unleashed fideism, and you have an unbound fideism, but that's described in another paper. So the only way we can kind of stop an infinite absolute negativity is for, dare I say, a new sincerity, the sort of affirmation that Derrida stressed he always wanted deconstruction to be toward, and maybe the pure thought that Hegel talks about, all of that, which will have to be expanded on elsewhere. But you see, without the trance of believability, it's really hard to engage in those positive practices and not feel like they themselves are arbitrary, or just arbitrarily selected expressions of a relative and conditioned subjectivity, where we can just kind of go, well, they don't have any absolute authority, and if they don't have any absolute authority, it's going to be really, really hard for them to stand against the infinite absolute negativity that Kierkegaard describes, because we can always just say, well, that's just my idea of what should be the sincere values, and so forth and so on. And again, this is described in Belonging Again. The other thing that the paper is going to talk about is this kind of interesting idea that one of the reasons that the trance of, and this gets linked up to why the trance of believability can contribute to the banality of evil, which, as you can see, we have a tragedy here, because if there's the trance of believability, then we could have the banality of evil, but if we don't have it, then we could have the infinite absolute negativity. So we have a problem here. But a further reason to associate the trance of believability as problems is that often the trance of believability is held up by our ideas of what constitutes realistic. And I think we can examine this when we read a book. We'll be reading a story and we'll have some teenagers sitting around talking about Deleuze, and we'll laugh and go, this isn't realistic, this isn't what people do. And so the trance of believability is broken and the book no longer works, because the words on the page suddenly become visible, they become words, and we become conscious of the fact we're reading as opposed to in the story, and it all kind of breaks down. Well, the problem here, of course, is that unless we're God, we really don't know what's realistic. Do we really know that there's no such thing? There are literally no teenagers in South Carolina who live on a farm who talk about Deleuze. Do we really know that? Well, we can't, and we're just very quick to suggest that it's not realistic. Now, granted, I mean, Peter Berger makes that point in A Far Glory, where if you know that someone is a liberal living in New York, then it's probable that they're pro-choice. It's not definite, but there's good reason to think that if you're a betting man. So I think that's fair, but that's very different from saying can't. When saying it's probable that a liberal in New York is pro-choice and a Republican in Virginia is pro-life, anti-abortion, pro-abortion for different terms. It's different from saying probable versus impossible. And what's interesting is actually when we judge a book, we're quite quick to claim something is unrealistic or realistic and to kind of close our mind. And it's quite interesting because a concern of mine is that the practice of judging realism versus believability may actually habituate us to discrimination and habituate us to closed-mindedness. So we may want to be better readers. My suggestion is when you read a book to be open to it, to judge it not on terms of believability, but on terms of the internal consistency of the story, on the operations of the story, and things like that. Now, of course, believability plays a role in so much that if a character jumps out of a plane and suddenly wings pop out of its back, well, we know that's impossible. So believability and realism are valid in so much as literal impossibilities given what we know about the scientific universe, but that's very different from saying that some teenagers can't like Deleuze. So we just have to be very careful with realism. And yet, realism... So ultimately what has to be argued is, since realism, though, can be the grounds for a banality of evil, we need to establish a new possibility for a trance of believability that is not primarily based on realism. And the paper's going to get into openness, where we need to maintain a state of openness and ground our believability on the internal consistency and lack of contradiction between differences, as opposed to judge what we think is believable relative to how we think the world works or should work or is probable to work. An open mind as opposed to a closed mind. Now, of course, everyone who's concerned about diversity certainly stresses the need for an open mind. This idea for an open mind is not new, but I think it is going to be different if we're talking about a openness that is based on the possibilities of life, the openness to what reality can unfold itself as opposed to our standard of realistic. So what I would say is that we just have to be careful that our open-mindedness is, the standard for it is not based on realism as opposed to something much bigger and transcendent. Now, what exactly that is going to be expanded on in the book The Fate of Beauty, and how perhaps beauty and aesthetics can play a role to overcoming the problems outlined in Belonging Again, but that is going to have to wait for later. So ultimately, when we read a story, we want to make sure that realism is not the standard by which we decide a story is believable or not. We instead want to make sure it's the internal operations of the story. And so it goes with society. We want to make sure that we don't go in society and determine that people are not acting in a manner that is part of the society, that is not that once you witness them, you say, well, it's not believable that they care about America or that they care about the society, because if they did, they'd be married by 28 or something. Or, oh, well, they would get a blue-collar job. Or they get a white-collar job. You can go back and forth. So we also want to be careful to not judge what we believe is someone who's being a good participant in society relative to our standards of what's believable that someone would do, and view that as being a good member of society. So we want to be open to different possibilities of how people can view themselves as adding value to society and participating in it, and that this openness could become a mutual ground by which makes possible a new collective. Because again, remember, we have to strike some kind of balance between givens and freedoms, between believability, between believability based on openness and total anarchy. Because again, if we don't have any trance of believability at all, we're going to be susceptible to infinite absolute negation. And arguably today, that's what we're really suffering. So how can we restore a new sincerity, which will require establishing positive premises, positive affirmations about how life should be, and yet avoid making that exclusive? Because once you establish something affirmative, in a way you have to make a definition. That means you have to draw a line, which means you're at risk of exclusion. So how can we find that middle ground between having definition, having meaningful identity, but simultaneously not having that definition become an exclusion, or I guess you could say, even if it is a kind of definition, perhaps rather than the lines be hard and black, there are little spaces between them, like where those parts on a road where you can switch lanes and it's not a problem. So a broken up line as opposed to a hard line. What does that look like? Well, I think that's going to get us into the question of beauty, which we'll have to wait for. But for more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.